Hitler. After the bunker, the version's history silenced. The man who dragged Europe into the greatest conflict of the 20th century caused the death of tens of millions and left scars still visible in history disappeared from the public scene in the final days of April 1945. For years, official archives maintained a single version. Adolf Hitler died in the Chancellery bunker at that final moment of the war. This was disseminated by the Allied commands and accepted by most historians. However, over time, other hypotheses emerged based on documents, testimonies, and unresolved omissions. In various parts of the world, agents, journalists, and witnesses recorded data that had been ignored for decades. What really happened to the dictator whom Europe never saw again after the fall of Berlin? The silenced origin, family secrets, and a lost trunk. In 1971, an FBI special agent went to a residence in the Bronx with the task of interrogating an elderly Irish woman who claimed to be Adolf Hitler's sister-in-law. Brigitte Hitler, born in Ireland, was married to Alois, the dictator's half-brother. She had been living in the United States for years, and after the rise of the name Hitler in the news, her story attracted the attention of the authorities. During that initial interrogation, the woman provided precise details about the political family she had known closely, revealing a more complex and darker picture than that disseminated in official accounts. The agent took note of every statement, including suspicions about Adolf's ancestry and the family secrets surrounding his identity. In subsequent years, that statement was complemented by other reports. One of the most relevant was from the OSS, the American intelligence agency during the war, which created a psychological and family profile of Hitler. The document pointed out inconsistencies in the official versions of his origins and mentioned persistent rumors suggesting irregularities in the paternal line. At the same time, Brigitte herself wrote a manuscript reconstructing daily life with Alois, describing his authoritarian character, his alcoholism, and the way he spoke of the young Adolf. The figure of the future dictator appeared shrouded in an atmosphere of contradictions, where apparent family rigidity mixed with uncomfortable silences and abrupt changes of residence that seemed to avoid outside eyes. Doubts about Adolf's identity went back even to previous generations. One key piece for understanding this environment was the report commissioned by J. Edgar Hoover, then director of the FBI. The text analyzed the surnames associated with Hitler, including the fact that his father Alois had initially been registered as Schicklgruber. This seemingly simple modification raised suspicions about the motives behind it. The change was not the result of chance, but of a legal process with motivations still debated. In this context, speculations arose that Alois might have been an illegitimate child, and that the correction of the surname sought to reinforce an appearance of family legitimacy that was not clearly supported by documentation. The authors of the report observed that, in various documents, the name Hitler appeared linked to other family members who lived in different locations and maintained tense relationships with each other. This family dispersion and fragmentation was not common in other biographies of the period. The emotional distance between relatives was also reflected in the letters collected by the OSS, which showed deliberate omissions and contradictory versions of the same events. Alois, a central figure in this network of silences, seemed to have constructed a personal narrative that excluded uncomfortable elements and reshaped his own family history to fit his social rise within the Austro-Hungarian civil service. Adolf's childhood took place in an environment where secrecy was not an exception but a silent norm. The boy grew up with an ambiguous image of his father marked by rigid authority and a lack of affectionate gestures. Brigitte recalled scenes in which young Adolf watched silently, absorbed in his own thoughts, while the domestic atmosphere was tense with arguments and episodes of verbal violence. Frequent moves, school changes, and limited interaction with other relatives reinforced the idea that something had to be kept hidden. Visits from certain relatives were abrupt and brief, as if they feared that a prolonged stay would reveal uncomfortable aspects of the environment. In one of the episodes mentioned by Brigitte, a family dispute revolved around a trunk containing old documents. Alois insisted on keeping it locked, preventing anyone from accessing its contents. The woman, intrigued by the secrecy, tried to open it during her husband's absence but was unsuccessful. The trunk, whose existence was confirmed by other witnesses, disappeared shortly after Alois's death, fueling suspicion that it contained compromising information about his origins. In later years, some researchers attempted to trace this object without success. As Gardner's investigation progressed, testimonies emerged that reinforced the idea of a childhood marked by concealment. Bridget's personal diary, partially preserved by her son William, included references to family events that had been silenced in the official narrative. The woman recounted how her husband avoided any mention of his family's past and reacted aggressively if anyone dared to ask. Adolf, according to these notes, grew up among adults who spoke in whispers and avoided topics related to his lineage. One of the most striking aspects of these documents was the way family photographs were avoided. Bridget pointed out that in her home there were barely any old portraits, and that even Alois's youthful images had been removed. In their place hung certificates and official documents projecting an orderly and respectable image, far from any hint of irregularity. This visual absence was consistent with the general tendency to erase uncomfortable traces and to rewrite from everyday life a history that did not fit the social parameters of the time. The surname Hitler, before being definitively adopted, went through several variants. This mutation was neither linear nor accidental. Gardner traced parish records, court archives, and birth certificates that revealed inconsistencies in dates, names, and parentage. Some records appeared to have been corrected by hand, others included marginal notes that did not match the versions circulated by the family. This pattern repeated across different localities, suggesting a sustained effort to consolidate an identity that concealed a more uncomfortable reality. The author also interviewed descendants of distant relatives who, after years of silence, agreed to share fragments of their family memory. Among them, a woman claimed to have heard in her childhood that Alois was not the biological son of the man appearing in the records, and that this secret was known to some clan members. This testimony coincided with rumors collected in OSS documents which stated that Alois's mother had worked as a maid in a Jewish household, fueling later speculation about the dictator's Semitic ancestry. In parallel, the author accessed a set of letters discussing the possibility that Alois had received money in exchange for his silence regarding certain aspects of his origin. The missives, dated decades before Adolf's rise, mentioned the delivery of an unspecified sum and were signed by a man identified only by initials. Although their authenticity could not be conclusively verified, the content was consistent with other indications pointing to a family negotiation intended to preserve appearances. The reviewed documents suggested a family pattern based on silences, omissions, and fragmentary accounts. From the earliest years, Adolf Hitler's life unfolded in an environment where controlling what was said and shown seemed more important than explaining what had actually occurred. This practice, reinforced by years of inherited contradictions, marked the beginning of a biography constructed in the shadows. The Kremlin dossier, Stalin and the perspective of doubt. In May 1945, Soviet forces had already taken full control of Berlin. Among the smoking ruins of the Reich, a group of NKVD officers began a secret operation. Their goal was not only to recover documents or arrest regime officials, but to gather every possible piece of information about what had actually happened to Adolf Hitler in his final days. From the very beginning, the agents received clear orders. Every testimony had to be collected meticulously without omitting any detail. No one in Moscow was willing to close the case. Some of the most important detainees were immediately transferred to facilities controlled by Soviet intelligence. Heinz Linger, who had served for years as Hitler's personal assistant, was captured and extensively interrogated. The same happened to Otto Günscher, responsible for the German leader's direct security. Both provided precise descriptions of the final days in the Chancellery. During the interrogations, the Soviets emphasized learning the exact movements within the bunker, the schedules, gestures, phrases, and any irregularities. Each statement was recorded, transcribed, and archived to be later reviewed by senior Secret Service officials. Over several months, the officers in charge of the case identified repetitive patterns in the accounts. However, they also detected contradictions. Some witnesses claimed to have witnessed the suicide, while others insisted they had not seen the body directly. This disparity did not go unnoticed. Investigators noted each difference and created comparative summaries between the versions. On several occasions, detainees were confronted with statements from other prisoners to verify the consistency of their testimonies. The tone of the interrogations was direct and persistent, with questions designed to detect gaps or possible deception. One critical point in the file was the absence of irrefutable evidence of Hitler's death. Although some witnesses mentioned seeing a wrapped or partially burned body, no one could verify its identity with certainty. This lack of absolute confirmation fueled distrust within the Kremlin, leading analysts to prepare a report reserved for Stalin that included not only the available accounts but also the inconsistencies detected within them. In 1949, 4 years after the collapse of the Third Reich, a confidential dossier was delivered to the Soviet leader. Under strict security measures, the file was prepared exclusively for his consultation. It included a meticulous reconstruction of the Führer's final days based on interrogations conducted in Berlin and later on Soviet territory. The statements of Linger and Günscher occupied a central place, as both had remained alongside Hitler until the end. Testimonies from other members of the inner circle, as well as information from Soviet officers who participated in the occupation of the Chancellery, were also incorporated. The document precisely described the daily routine within the bunker, the meetings held during the final days, the movements of those present, and the physical and psychological condition of the German leader. Despite the richness of details, the report did not offer a definitive conclusion. Rather than asserting that Hitler had died, the text presented the statements as hypotheses subject to verification. It was emphasized that due to the partial destruction of the remains and the lack of direct and irrefutable confirmation, there was room for doubt. This stance was not accidental. It reflected the Soviet regime's interest in keeping all possibilities open. Stalin read the document carefully. Although he publicly did not make extensive statements about its content, it is known that his distrust of the German version increased. In several internal meetings, he expressed that he was not convinced of the suicide. He considered it possible that Hitler had managed to escape amid the chaos of the final battles. This suspicion led to new instructions within the intelligence apparatus. It was ordered to review reports from other fronts, monitor rumors in various European countries, and remain alert to any indications regarding the whereabouts of the Nazi leader. The dossier also included detailed schematics of the bunker, lists of those present during the final days, and maps with access and exit routes. Each element was accompanied by technical comments prepared by Soviet analysts. In many cases, grey areas or events without clear witnesses were highlighted. This manner of presentation contributed to reinforcing uncertainty. Beyond the physical evidence found in the Chancellery, the Soviets insisted that none could be considered conclusive without direct support. Even statements that appeared solid were accompanied by warnings about their possible fragility. In the following years, the content of the report remained secret. Only a small group of officers had access to the original document. In parallel, classified copies were made for internal use by the MGB. These versions were used as references in subsequent investigations, both in the Soviet Union and in some Allied countries. The initial distrust did not diminish over time. On the contrary, analyses continued throughout the decade. Some segments of the report were updated with new statements obtained in Soviet detention centers. The annexes of the dossier included full transcriptions of the key interrogations. The questions were written uniformly and the answers were literal. In several cases, the detainees provided unexpected details that drew the analysts' attention. For example, the differences in the way each described the exact moment of the alleged suicide or the subsequent cremation. The lack of synchronization between the accounts reinforced the thesis that the information was incomplete. The committee responsible for drafting emphasized that, given the impossibility of scientifically verifying what occurred, it was necessary to consider other possibilities. Starting in 1950, the reports derived from the file began circulating among other divisions of the Soviet apparatus. Although their use remained limited, some fragments were shared with counterintelligence services. At that time, the priority was to monitor any attempt of the German leader's reappearance under a false identity. Orders were issued to investigate embassies, consulates, and areas under Soviet surveillance abroad. The original report, however, remained under the direct custody of the Kremlin, considered a key piece of the war documentation. The existence of the document generated speculation even within the Soviet environment. Some MGB officers who had not had direct access to the file began formulating hypotheses based on partial fragments. This incomplete circulation gave rise to rumors and alternative versions of what happened in April 1945. However, none of them were officially recognized. The dossier, as delivered to Stalin, remained the only compendium validated by the Soviet leadership. Any contradiction had to be resolved by comparing the original testimonies with the observations of the report. The final conclusions of the dossier avoided asserting categorical facts. Instead of declaring that Hitler had died in the bunker, it stated that the testimonies pointed to that possibility, though without conclusive evidence. This ambiguity was interpreted by many as a clear sign that the Kremlin kept other lines of investigation open. The decision not to close the case responded to a logic of constant surveillance. For Stalin and his entourage, any certainty had to be built on irrefutable evidence. Until that occurred, the report would serve as a basis to maintain the hypothesis that the Nazi leader had not been completely eliminated. The wrong body, the forensic confusion in Berlin. In the spring of 1945, when the Soviet army entered Berlin, one of its main objectives was to discover exactly what had happened to Adolf Hitler. The official version held that he had taken his own life inside the bunker, but the Soviet investigators who arrived at the chancellery encountered a confusing scene full of contradictions. Among the rubble, charred bodies, unidentified remains, and conflicting testimonies appeared, soon sowing deep doubts. Those first days were crucial to understanding how the version that would later be accepted as true was constructed, although from the beginning there were cracks that were difficult to ignore. On May 2nd, as some soldiers advanced among the smoldering remains, a Soviet officer located a large metal box. Inside were partially burned human remains. No immediate analysis was done, nor were key samples preserved. That discovery, far from closing the investigation, opened it completely. Soon rumors began to circulate among the troops and commanders. Was Hitler really one of the bodies found? Where was the evidence? And why could no one confirm anything for sure? A few days later, new remains were found, this time in a nearby crater. The Soviets extracted a male and a female body, both charred. One of the reconnaissance officers thought they might correspond to Hitler and Eva Braun. However, upon inspection, they noticed something strange. The male body wore a uniform with insignia different from those of the Nazi leader. There were also no clear dental records or fragments allowing precise identification. Despite this, they transferred the remains to a secret location and began forensic evaluations, though without systematic methodology or proper documentation. The first interrogations of those who had been in the bunker provided disparate and inconsistent accounts. The statements about what had happened lacked sufficient precision to clearly reconstruct the events. The Soviet authorities took note, but acknowledged the impossibility of establishing a single narrative from such fragmented versions. Amid the confusion, a new lead emerged. An aide to the Führer, who had been detained by the Soviets, mentioned that Hitler had given precise instructions for his body to be incinerated until unrecognizable. He also explained that before his death he had met with his closest associates and ordered them to destroy any trace that could allow his identification. That statement seemed to explain the condition of the recovered bodies but did not resolve the most important question. Was it really him? In the following days, Soviet agents continued exploring the bunker and its surroundings, recovering various bone objects. Without clear collection protocols, many fragments were stored without identifying their origin. This oversight caused confusion and hindered subsequent forensic evaluations. Although some remains were sent to Moscow, there was no reliable documentation linking them unequivocally to the dictator. As the investigations progressed, some Soviet officers attempted to reconstruct Hitler's dental history based on oral accounts from attendants and doctors in his circle. But these attempts lacked an official medical source. Matches were sought between recovered teeth and scant testimonies, generating interpretations of limited forensic value. This strategy, although logical in an emergency context, reflected the documentary precariousness with which a case of such magnitude was intended to be closed. Among the objects found near the bunker, a bone fragment was recovered, which at the time was the subject of speculation by some officers. Although it showed a suggestive mark, it lacked verifiable context and origin. With insufficient data for evaluation, it was simply stored without further implications, remaining in the limbo of poorly recorded evidence. The Soviets decided to keep the findings secret. Only a small group within Stalin's close circle had access to the information. The rest of the world, and much of the Soviet army, was to continue believing that Hitler's body had not been found. In fact, on May 2nd, the TASS agency published a statement suggesting that the news of Hitler's death could be a maneuver to facilitate his escape. That statement further fueled suspicions, although in reality it reflected the lack of solid evidence. Shortly thereafter, another charred body was discovered near the bunker entrance. A soldier mistook it for the Nazi leader due to physical resemblance and hairstyle. However, the uniform worn did not correspond to Hitler's, and upon closer examination it was found to be a double used for security at public events. The discovery of the double contributed to general confusion. If his body appeared there, wasn't it possible that it had also been used as a decoy to cover the real disappearance? The collection of evidence became increasingly disorganized. Every new object or human remains that appeared was arbitrarily attributed to the case. The photographs had no annotations or context. Witness statements contradicted each other. The investigators began to privately admit that it was impossible to guarantee the identity of the bodies found. However, they needed an official conclusion to present to Stalin. To close the file, the Soviet authorities drafted a report stating that according to dental remains and collected testimonies, Hitler had died in the bunker and had been cremated by his assistants. This version was accepted, although many important details remained unclear. Doubts about the skull, contradictions in statements, and the lack of verifiable medical evidence were omitted. The essential thing was to consider the case closed and affirm that the enemy had been defeated. Over time, the collected remains were stored in secret facilities. Some of them were lost or never properly recorded. No one could ensure that the bone fragments belonged to the same body. Investigators who reopened the case years later found incomplete reports, altered evidence, and gaps in the chain of custody. Nevertheless, the official version was never changed. The handling of the remains found in Berlin was rushed. Authorities acted under pressure and without sufficient time to implement systematic procedures. The evidence gathered was partial and often poorly documented, which made the official account rely on poorly verifiable elements. Over time, some of these initial decisions remained unrevised. Operation Snake, the theory of a possible escape from Berlin. During the final months of the war, as the German defeat approached rapidly, some operations were carried out away from the spotlight. In various parts of Europe, certain groups worked discreetly to establish routes that did not follow normal military retreat movements. From early 1945, civilian and military transport planes conducted little recorded movements. Some of these flights followed atypical paths, avoiding combat corridors and landing at bases controlled by elements sympathetic to the regime. A man who claimed to have witnessed several of these flights provided details about a series of transfers between Berlin and a base in Denmark. He said he had seen aircraft depart under maximum security conditions. According to his words, an important figure of the Third Reich was involved. Although his testimony was not officially corroborated, it was considered in some later reports. Flights to northern Italy were also reported from areas still under German control, demonstrating that air corridors remained operational longer than previously believed. Inside the bunker, the situation became more tense as the Soviet encirclement tightened. While the surface burned under bombardment, some tunnels remained accessible. Witnesses stated that there was an underground network allowing exit from the heart of the bunker to other nearby structures. One of these paths led to a building from which it was possible to reach an improvised runway on foot. On April 27th, some reports indicate that a figure resembling Hitler was seen exiting one of these tunnels, escorted by several armed men. He wore a uniform identical to the Nazi leaders but did not interact with anyone. According to records, this person boarded a covered vehicle that departed for an unknown destination. The operation was swift, without pause, and was not officially documented in the bunker's diaries. Simultaneously, in other parts of the city, some Luftwaffe pilots received contradictory orders. One mentioned that he was urgently called to prepare a light aircraft. He was asked to keep the engine running for over an hour without taking off. He was not allowed to see the passengers, and then he was ordered to withdraw. This testimony, though fragmentary, was cited in a classified file years later. Doubles had always been part of the regime's security strategy. Since 1939, the existence of at least 3 individuals trained to imitate the dictator's gestures, voice, and presence had been documented. One of them disappeared in March 1945. It is suspected that he was used in some covert operation during the fall of Berlin. A forensic doctor consulted after the war said that one of the bodies found had features different from the real Hitler, especially in the shape of the ears and jaw. Another unsettling element was the use of submarines on unconventional routes. In the naval archives of Kiel, records were found of 2 U-boats that departed without a full crew. Some sailors stated that they did not know where they were heading or who was on board. What they did confirm was that they were carrying sealed cargo and that they set sail in the dead of night. One of these submarines was never recovered. There was also talk of a hidden airstrip on the outskirts of Berlin. Technicians who worked in the area stated that in the days prior to the surrender, hectares of forest were cleared and a surface prepared to allow emergency takeoffs. Several trucks and an escorted convoy arrived in the area. Although official documentation never mentions it, aerial photos taken in June show a clear rectangular area where trees once stood. Regarding diplomatic movements, there were private meetings between SS leaders and figures from neutral governments. During these meetings, possible escape routes and the protection of certain key individuals were discussed. An emissary from a South American country was seen entering a Ministry of Foreign Affairs office on April 30th. No one could explain why he was there. His visit was not recorded through the usual channels. Several witnesses stated that they saw a person very similar to Hitler board a small plane at a secondary base south of Berlin. What drew attention was the number of escorts present and the total silence surrounding the flight. No Allied radar recorded this departure. The aircraft disappeared from the airspace heading southwest. Its route coincided with one of the routes used by clandestine flights weeks earlier. During post-war interrogations, some aviation technicians stated that certain transport planes had been modified to carry pressurized capsules. These structures allowed a person to be moved without being seen, even during external inspections. Although these versions were not confirmed with direct evidence, they match documents describing unusual modifications in workshops in the Saxony region. On May 1st, a military train departed from the vicinity of Berlin with an unknown destination. Among its wagons, one was identified as completely sealed. The soldiers guarding the convoy did not know what it was carrying. They only received orders to protect it at all costs. Upon reaching a junction, the wagon was detached and diverted onto another line. It never reached the original destination. One of the most detailed interrogations was that of a radio operator who said he received a coded transmission from Berlin at 11 o'clock on the night of April 30th. It used a previously agreed-upon language to confirm that the Hawk had flown. This code had been practiced months earlier as part of a drill. The operator recognized it immediately. The mass destruction of documents also played a key role. Between April 25th and 30th, thousands of files were burned in the inner courtyards of the bunker. Several officials were seen throwing entire folders into the flames. Some of these papers contained direct orders regarding movements, transport use, and authorized personnel lists. Despite Soviet surveillance, only charred fragments were saved. Another fact kept secret for years was the existence of a plan called Operation Snake. This protocol involved creating an escape route with multiple layers of cover. It involved the use of camouflaged vehicles, alternate railway routes, movements at variable times, and physical replacements through trained doubles. Although the original file disappeared, some fragments were found in a classified report in 1953. One of the last leads emerged during an interrogation in Prague. A former member of the Führer's personal escort recounted that on May 1st he was ordered to deliver a briefcase to a civilian-dressed person waiting at the station. That person left in a car with falsified plates. The contents of the briefcase were never known. The only thing recorded was the vehicle number, which was never located. The sum of scattered clues, from still operational tunnels to unrecorded air movements, physical replacements, rerouted trains, or destroyed documents, pointed to a sequence of actions that did not respond to the chaos at the end, but to a silent and premeditated logistics. Each movement seemed calculated to disappear at the exact moment, leaving no verifiable traces or clear chronology. The Argentine hypothesis, the hidden dictator in Patagonia. In the months following the collapse of the Third Reich, various intelligence agencies detected movements that could not be attributed to simple refugees. There were transfers of gold and currency to banks in Buenos Aires and Montevideo, as well as discreet arrivals of men with irregular documentation. Reports agreed that it was not just about fleeing, but a network designed to support a central figure. In the Argentine Patagonia, remote properties were acquired, protected with fences, guards, and restricted access. Local witnesses spoke of solid constructions of foreign origin and of the frequent arrival of visitors with a German accent. No one could enter without an invitation, and employees were quickly replaced if they asked too many questions. Local authorities never investigated. One of the most mentioned enclaves was located near Bariloche. Several neighbors claimed to have seen an older man of rigid posture moving with armed companions. His circle spoke only in German and avoided any contact with the outside. The movements were precise. Caravans traveling at unpredictable times, vehicles entering via private roads, and regular deliveries of supplies. European and South American reports described that life on these estates followed a consistent pattern. The central resident received visits from former hierarchs, engineers, and logistics officials who had managed to escape with new identities. Hidden funds, economic projects, and ways to maintain a cohesive international network were discussed. It was not a retreat, but a continuation of the structure that had survived the defeat. The conditions on site exceeded the surroundings: electric generators, food reserves, medical staff, and camouflaged watchtowers. The archives mention photographs never released to the public. In one of them, a man with grey hair and a short moustache appears on the porch of a mountain house. Although of low quality, several witnesses claimed to recognize familiar gestures and features. Some journalists tried to approach, but they were intercepted by plainclothesmen who claimed it was private property. Press reports about the area were scarce, ambiguous, or simply disappeared from the archives. In parallel, electricity consumption records and financial movements from Swiss accounts confirmed that the properties had been inhabited and maintained for decades. Testimonies about the man's routine agreed: walks with a large dog, reading documents in the afternoon, and private meetings twice a week. He never participated in public celebrations, nor revealed his identity at fairs or markets. In those spaces, he always paid in cash and left silently. One of the most unique accounts comes from a European correspondent who reportedly had brief access to the estate. He described a deep voice, a rigid posture, and an environment where discrete symbols of the past could be perceived, although nothing incriminating was visible. He died shortly afterward, leaving no copies of his testimony. Over the years, age and health weakened the resident, but he never lost his discipline. He continued receiving reports, issuing instructions, and maintaining control over those around him. For his followers, he represented a living symbol of continuity, a reminder that defeat had not been final. When the properties began to be abandoned, they were overtaken by vegetation or transferred to private companies that blocked all investigation. However, among exiles and former collaborators, the same conviction always circulated. In the mountains of southern Argentina, the man who had changed the course of the 20th century continued to rule, hidden for years. The Odessa alternative, the international cover-up network. During the final months of the conflict, several members of the regime began preparing their escape routes. There was no single master plan, but contacts, transit points, and resources were shared to facilitate the flight. Some officers knew that their past would prevent any reintegration into German civilian life. Others sensed that their involvement would be too visible to avoid prosecution. In this context, informal networks emerged which later consolidated into more organized structures, often favored by the confusion of the moment and the multiplicity of jurisdictions. One key element was the lack of immediate coordination among the Allies, which allowed several figures to escape undetected. Although in theory there was a common interest in capturing the main perpetrators, in practice, procedures were not aligned, and legal gaps became exploitable spaces to evade justice. With false documents, civilian clothes, and well-placed contacts, many managed to cross borders or settle in less monitored occupation zones. In Italy, the routes south became common corridors. Those who reached Bolzano or Murano often had access to monasteries or religious institutions where they could hide for weeks or months. Early records indicate that several Benedictine monasteries offered refuge, although not always with direct knowledge of the crimes committed by their guests. Sometimes, simply presenting oneself as a disoriented soldier was enough to receive help. The network of ecclesiastical hospices between South Tyrol and Rome ended up being a strategic route. The Vatican, through offices such as the Pontifical Assistance Commission, issued temporary identity documents to refugees without discriminating their origin. These credentials were used to manage travel papers or move through controlled areas. In parallel, baptismal certificates were issued, allowing fugitives to present themselves with Christianized first names and invented surnames. Upon arriving in Rome, many went to charitable institutions near the Tiber, where they found discreet accommodation. In some cases, transfers to South America were organized by agencies operating under the guise of humanitarian aid. Official stamps were used to authorize travel and embarkation, often from ports such as Genoa or Naples. Tickets were paid in cash without traceability, and the names on passenger lists did not always match those on the passports presented. Occasionally, beneficiaries boarded under duplicate identities that were later destroyed at sea. In the Argentine case, the conditions for the entry of European exiles proved exceptionally flexible. Immigration authorities offered fast visas to those claiming technical training, and in many embassies, a sworn declaration was enough to obtain the necessary documentation. This framework allowed the arrival of individuals who, under other circumstances, would have been subject to greater scrutiny. Paraguay and Bolivia also offered refuge to several fugitives. In Asunción, there were accommodations prepared by German intermediaries that served as waiting points. These places functioned as intermediate stations before permanent settlement in rural areas. In La Paz, some local officials collaborated by issuing residence certificates in exchange for financial compensation. In both countries, geographic dispersion made tracking newcomers difficult. A central element in the flight of many was the existence of safe routes known as escape lines. These branched out from Austria, passed through northern Italy, and reached Rome. From there, fugitives were distributed to intercontinental destinations. Some routes included stops at ports, such as Lisbon or Barcelona. Each journey was managed by different intermediaries, but all shared connection points where false identities were checked and final instructions delivered. The term Odessa began circulating among journalists and Western agents in the late 1940s, although there is no concrete evidence that this organization had a formalized structure. However, there were networks of former officers who helped each other through letters, contacts, or remittances. Some of these connections went back to military academies or specific units. Assistance was offered without the need to belong to a formal institution. It was enough to know someone in the right place. In several European monasteries, some clergy consciously helped former officials. In other cases, they acted according to the principle of hospitality without investigating backgrounds. Franciscan orders were noted as particularly receptive at that time. In Rome, certain priests received newcomers and instructed them on how to behave, which names to use, and how to respond if interrogated. This practical guidance gave them a considerable advantage. The International Committee of the Red Cross played a controversial role. While its intention was to assist displaced persons, in practice it facilitated temporary passports for people who were not thoroughly verified. Some forms were filled out with invented data and were not cross-checked with the available databases. Red Cross passports allowed boarding ships bound for America without major controls. In several cases, the same individual managed to obtain more than one document by changing small parts of the name. The Swiss embassies in Italy issued transit permits under unclear circumstances. Although officially intended for refugees, several members of the former regime used these permits to cross into France or Switzerland. From there, they continued their journey through clandestine routes or via travel agencies willing to accept bribes. The lack of coordination between embassies and security agencies meant that records were not shared, making any verification difficult. In West Germany, former collaborators grouped into veterans or exile associations, from which they maintained contact with those abroad. Some of these groups organized fundraisers or sent packages to distant countries. Letters were written in simple codes indicating the status of each person. Lists with contact addresses and recommendations on doctors, lawyers, or reliable officials in different cities were also shared. During the 1950s, several war criminals lived in South America without drastically changing their appearance. Many retained their European accents and habits. This did not arouse suspicion, as immigrant communities were numerous. In Argentine and Brazilian localities, newcomers integrated into communities where other refugees protected them. Authorities rarely investigated whether they had political or economic backing. Contacts within shipping companies were key to managing discreet shipments. Some employees deleted passenger records or altered manifests. This allowed fugitives to travel undetected or appear under different names at each port. In certain cases, ships were boarded at sea by smaller vessels to conduct exchanges. This maneuver prevented the fugitive's name from being recorded at the destination port. Intelligence agents from Western countries were aware of these routes but prioritized other objectives. Some internal reports mentioned names and locations, but political decisions hindered actions. In other cases, it was considered that these fugitives could be useful for strategic purposes. This created an environment of temporary impunity that allowed prolonged settlements without official intervention. Cover-up mechanisms also included the creation of fake work certificates. Invented histories were made placing fugitives in civilian jobs during the conflict. These documents were used to justify their presence in new countries. Fake letters of recommendation with signatures from former officials were also issued. In some cases, official seals were precisely recreated to appear authentic. Collaboration among fugitives was constant. They alerted each other to risks or changes in migration policies. They used codes in their letters or sent messages through intermediaries. When one was discovered, the others acted quickly to change their plans. In some cases, documents were destroyed or houses were abruptly abandoned. This dynamic of constant alertness was key to sustaining the network for years. The trafficking of goods was also a secondary but significant element. Some fugitives carried jewelry, artworks, or precious metals that they used to finance their escape. These items were sold to collectors or intermediaries in exchange for money or favors. Occasionally, they were traded for documents or transport. This mobile capital ensured independence and facilitated movement. For more than a decade, escape routes operated without major interruptions. The structures were flexible and adapted to political changes. Over time, some networks were dismantled, but others transformed into closed communities where fugitives lived unrecognized. The judgment of science, DNA versus official history. In April 2009, a forensic investigator entered a Moscow archive accompanied by a US documentary team. Inside a white box labeled Germany lay key pieces that for decades had been displayed as the definitive evidence of the dictator's demise. The woman leading the examination, specialized in human remains, carefully extracted a bone fragment about 10 centimeters long. It had a curved shape, and in one area a visible fracture line was noticeable. For years, that piece had been presented as part of the German leader's skull, specifically from the parietal region. Gently, the fragment was transferred to a plastic bag for analysis. The environment was controlled, with everyone present wearing gloves and the camera recording every movement. The expert, who had previously collaborated with US federal laboratories, was surprised from the start. The sutures of the bone did not match those of an adult male. After an initial review, the hypothesis was that this skull belonged to a woman between 30 and 40 years old. In parallel, dental remains were extracted from a small metal box. Inside were several dental crowns, gold bridges, and a lower jaw with some teeth still in place. All metal objects were loose, as if collected at different stages or with rudimentary methods. Some teeth showed signs of having been exposed to high temperatures, though none were completely calcined. The central piece was a human-appearing lower jaw. A visual inspection revealed a front tooth with a characteristic metal restoration, historically associated with the dentition of the person sought. However, when compared with photographs taken at the beginning of the last century, no clear matches were found. The teeth did not fit the clinical descriptions nor the dental charts prepared by dental assistants during the war. The forensic specialist in charge requested authorization to perform molecular tests. After obtaining samples from the interior of the bone and the dental surface, the material was sent to a human genetics laboratory in Connecticut. There, a mitochondrial DNA extraction protocol was applied, using techniques typically employed for degraded or uncertain remains. The results took several weeks and, when communicated, had an immediate impact. The analysis revealed that the skull fragment did not possess markers compatible with a male. The genetic sequence corresponded unequivocally to a female. This conclusion was verified by a second laboratory which used a different technique to rule out possible contamination or methodological errors. Both studies agreed. The bone displayed for years as evidence of suicide did not belong to the dictator. The jaw, on the other hand, presented a more complex situation. The recovered DNA was insufficient to obtain a complete profile. The condition of the material, likely subjected to fire and subsequent handling, hindered any conclusive verification. However, a partial genetic marker was isolated that also did not match the available records of the suspect's maternal line. Although this result was not definitive, it did increase doubts. Upon the dissemination of these findings, several media outlets revisited the discussion on the authenticity of the evidence stored by the Soviet government. For decades, the skull fragment had occasionally been shown to foreign delegations, being treated as irrefutable evidence. However, internal archive documents revealed inconsistencies in the collection process. The exact locations where the remains were found, as well as the time of recovery, had not been recorded accurately. Some reports indicated that the bone pieces were extracted by soldiers without scientific training, while others suggested that they were mixed with debris collected after explosions. In 1946, one of the agents who worked on the initial reports expressed doubts in an internal letter. He noted that the remains were incomplete and that some of the dental metal elements did not match the oral description provided by former members of the leader's entourage. This correspondence, previously ignored, was recovered by the authors of the contemporary investigation and used as a starting point to re-evaluate the official narrative. In 2010, a new independent analysis attempted to replicate the genetic studies. Access to the same bone fragment was requested, but authorization was denied. The argument was that the current condition of the object did not guarantee proper preservation after another extraction. Nevertheless, a scanning electron microscope applied to previously obtained images revealed details of fibers present on the surface. These matched female tissue, reinforcing the previous findings. The researchers also consulted dental specialists experienced in historical reconstructions. These experts evaluated the dental bridges and restorations present. One of the gold crowns, in particular, featured a design that was not manufactured in Central Europe in the 1940s. According to manufacturing records, this type of technique had only been common in southern Russia in the late 1930s, opening the possibility that the remains belonged to a different patient, possibly a victim of bombings or the mass executions recorded in the area in the final days of the conflict. In 2012, a documentary broadcast in France presented a three-dimensional reconstruction of the jaw based on high-resolution scans. The generated model was compared with the only existing dental X-rays of the sought individual. The differences were significant. The inclination of the incisors, the position of the molars, and the mandibular angle did not match. These observations led the program's producers to request an official statement from the Russian authorities. The response was ambiguous, indicating that the remains were kept in custody and that no new investigation was planned. The following year, a team of French journalists gained access to documents stored in Paris, referring to diplomatic exchanges between Moscow and Berlin in the years after the war. In one of these writings, a Soviet official admitted that a complete forensic verification of the attributed remains had never been carried out. According to that report, the items were accepted as valid under pressure from senior officials, eager to close the case as soon as possible. Subsequent scientific advances, however, allowed DNA sequences to be identified in bone remains exposed to extreme temperatures, reigniting interest in re-examining the evidence. In 2016, access to the skull fragment was again requested, this time using mass spectrometry and isotopic analysis techniques. The request was denied. Nonetheless, the previous results had already set a precedent. The consensus in the forensic community was clear. There was no absolute certainty that the preserved remains belonged to the individual in question. One of the geneticists involved in the first study stated that, in judicial terms, the evidence would be considered invalid. Neither the chain of custody was clear, nor had the origin of the material been rigorously documented. The fact that the skull belonged to a woman automatically eliminated its probative value. As for the dental elements, lacking verifiable matches, they could not support a definitive conclusion. In retrospect, the case illustrated how a narrative built on ambiguous objects could persist for decades without a solid scientific basis. The existence of doubts based on genetic and dental evidence undermined the argument of certainty that had dominated for generations. Far from closing the discussion, 21st century investigations had raised new questions about one of the most emblematic episodes of the war's end. The forbidden line, the last Hitlers in the 21st century. When the journalist entered the small home of the Wolf brothers, he found a simple living room decorated with ordinary objects and without any signs of extravagance. In front of him were three elderly men with the same last name that had been erased from history. They did not want to be recorded or photographed, and asked that their real names not be mentioned. They agreed to speak with caution, aware of the weight their words could carry. They had lived in Long Island for decades, staying away from media attention. They only agreed to the meeting out of respect for the intermediary who had contacted them. The atmosphere in the room was tense. One of the brothers got up, went to the kitchen and returned with 3 glasses of water. Another watched the journalist without saying a word. The third, the oldest, was the one who finally broke the silence. He confirmed that they were descendants of Alois Hitler Jr., the dictator's half-brother, and that they had come to the United States after World War II. In a calm voice, he said that the family had decided not to have children in order to end the lineage. He did not present it as a symbolic act, but as a practical decision. None of the 3 married. They lived working, paying taxes, and avoiding any public attention. Elsewhere in the world, a man claimed to be the result of a relationship between Hitler and a French woman. Jean-Marie Laurey was born in 1918 in Picardy, and his mother revealed his father's identity shortly before she died. The story said that Hitler had been in France during World War I as a messenger for the German army, and that during a brief stay in Fournes-en-Vep, he met Charlotte Lobjois. The woman was 16 years old when the relationship began. Years later, she told her son that the unknown soldier was the future dictator. Lauret, initially skeptical, began to investigate. He hired lawyers, spoke with historians, and gathered documents, including letters from his mother referring to the young German. Lauret worked as a teacher and lived an ordinary life. He never sought fame. His interest in clarifying the matter grew after the publication of some military documents placing Hitler near the village where he had been conceived. Some witnesses claimed to have seen Charlotte walking with a soldier with a foreign accent. Others remembered a young man who drew a lot and wrote poems. The coincidences began to accumulate. In the 70s, Lauret authorized graphological tests comparing his handwriting with that of the dictator. The results showed similarities, although experts avoided categorical statements. Journalist David Gardner gained access to Lauret's personal papers after his death. He reviewed notarial documents, letters, and interviews recorded by third parties. In some of those texts, Lauret recounted the moment when his mother confessed everything to him. He described a scene in the kitchen with his pale mother, telling him that his father had been someone the world hated. The shock was immediate. He had trouble sleeping for weeks. His surroundings learned over time, but never asked questions. Lauret requested to be buried without mention of his origin. He only wanted to disappear. One of the most controversial elements of the case was a series of genetic analyses conducted using a napkin used by a descendant of Lauret. The sample was sent anonymously to a European laboratory. There, a team examined the DNA and compared it with indirect samples from the alleged paternal lineage. According to results leaked by a collaborator of the study, certain markers matched a specific profile from a region in southern Germany. However, the report was not officially published, and the laboratory refused to comment. There was no official confirmation or response to the analyses. In parallel, another researcher mentioned the existence of an alleged son in South America. The man, of Argentine nationality, was said to have been adopted by a family close to the Nazi regime. Some reports indicated he had been registered under a false name and that his biological mother had worked as a nurse during the war. The information appeared in a French intelligence file, but without further details. The dates matched the last years of the conflict, although there was no clear evidence directly linking Hitler to that woman. The alleged son died in the 1990s, leaving no descendants. The governments involved avoided commenting. The embassies consulted stated they had no official records of the cases. Some files were closed, and others were lost over time. The climate of secrecy fueled doubts. Historical organizations refused to participate in debates about genetic inheritance. Private collectors offered to buy personal items of the alleged descendants, but the families stayed away. No one wanted to profit from the name. Most preferred to change their name, move, or break contact with the past. Gardner's book recounts another case in Germany where a middle-aged man claimed to have documents linking him to the Hitler family. He claimed to have found old letters in his grandmother's attic, signed by a woman named Pölzl. The content referred to a child given to a distant family to avoid rumors. Apparently it was an unplanned pregnancy that had been silenced for convenience. The man tried to deliver the letters to a museum but received no response. Later, he disappeared from the public eye. Austrian authorities also intervened in some episodes. In the 1980s, they ordered the sealing of archives containing references to possible family branches. They cited security and privacy reasons. The measure was criticized by some historians who requested access to study the impact of the past on future generations. However, regional governments maintained the confidentiality order. Parish records, identity documents, and hospital registers remained inaccessible for decades. Over time, rumors of possible biological heirs became less frequent but more persistent. Some private investigators claimed to have leads, while others treated the matter as taboo. Television networks showed interest in the cases, though most avoided delving deeper for fear of controversy. Known descendants always maintained the same stance: silence, neither denial nor confirmation, only distance. In New York, the three brothers who started this story continued with their routine. One worked as a gardener, another as a maintenance technician, and the eldest spent his final years caring for the other two. Their apartment remained unchanged, with old furniture, a radio on, and anonymous portraits on the walls. They never welcomed any journalist again. Their story remained recorded only in unsigned recordings, in archives that no one wanted to open fully. The existence of a genetic line linked to the dictator remains an unsolved mystery. The evidence never reached a definitive conclusion, and those involved disappeared into anonymity. Doubts persist, although the answers will likely remain buried with those who knew them. The story closed many doors, but some remained ajar. What was inherited was not power, fortune, or political legacy, but a silence hard to break.